Hello, everyone, and welcome back to our State of the Program series. Tonight, it's Ohio State. I'm your host, Sean Vowells. I've got Joe Meade with me, too. And we'll keep the same strategy for these sorts of videos. It'll be a little bit of a season recap from the 2025 season at first, and then we'll transition into how it looks for 2026. So, Joe, Ohio State came into the 2025 season as the defending champions after you know, what happened last year. They lose two regular season games, they get into the playoff, and they run the table. They had extremely high expectations this year. They started off with a win against Texas in which they only won by 7 points, but they dominated. And then they sort of dominated the entire way through the regular season. And then, when the level of competition ramped up, they lost to Indiana in the Big Ten championship game, and then they lost to Miami in the college football playoff. So we'll get into a little bit more specifics overall, but it really sort of fell apart pretty fast for this year for Ohio State.
Uh, yeah, it was kind of an interesting season, Sean, because going into the offseason, I know they were ranked number three, and I know some people thought they could repeat, but really after week one, you heard them as the overwhelming national title favorite. Until that October 11th game at Oregon, Sean, a lot of people still weren't nationally, even in the Big Ten, weren't really big on Indiana, and kind of the way the conference was viewed as was it's Penn State or Ohio State's to lose. And after week one, after that I'd say a really impressive, extremely impressive defensive debut as D coordinator for Matt Patricia. They get things going. They dominate Texas. They make Steve Sarkisian look like a fool. They make Arch Manning look like a pedestrian high school quarterback. And from there, they have two easy non-conference games. I know the Ohio one was pretty underwhelming. But then from that point on, Sean, they kind of just methodically would dismember inferior Big Ten opponents just throughout late September into October. And you kind of wondered when they'd get challenged. And then as we saw Penn State fall apart very spectacularly and watch that recap video from September 27th to pretty much the rest of October, it looked like Ohio State wasn't going to get a real test until the Michigan games. So kind of the first 2 months, Sean, believe it or not, was more about what could Ohio State do outside of their elite passing game. We knew they had Jeremiah Smith going and Cardell Tate. We saw the emergence at times of Max Clare. We of course saw Julian Sayin emerge into a Heisman finalist as a quarterback. So kind of the first 2 months were not eventful. They had like the kind of somewhat injuries to certain guys, but nothing too serious. Just struggle with the running game, I'd say, between Jackson, Peoples, and Donaldson.
And their defense is obviously something that was a big talking point throughout the year. Joe, was it better than last year's? I think statistically, it probably was. Now, I don't really think the defense was at fault in their losses this year. They gave up 13 points to Indiana and then 17 points to Miami, if you remember a pick six there. So defensively, I think they may have made a step this year in the right direction. They got into a couple of shootouts last year. The Oregon game that they lost was in the 30s, and their offense just sort of bludgeoned everybody in the playoffs. So defensively, this team, like, none of these games were anywhere close because the offense would be methodical. They would take their time. They wouldn't really take a lot of chances. They'd save their bodies for later in the season by not running a lot of tempo, and they'd win these games, mid 30s to mid teens, but it really was over in the second quarter. And the prevailing theory there was that they would be able to do that to anybody. And that really wasn't the case. The first time where they really entered the second half without having already won the game was in Ann Arbor. And it was the second drive was the long touchdown to Tate, which kind of
Yep.
put that thing away. So still, the beginning of that one was a little bit worrisome from Ohio State. But once they got that monkey off their back and they beat their rivals, who they were probably that much better than this year, the prevailing theory was that they would be able to do this to anyone, and that really wasn't the case. So that's really where this season was lost for them, is that they were not able to dictate proceedings against Indiana and Miami the way that they were everyone else. And remember, Joe, going into the Big Ten championship game, we did say that Indiana had played in a few close games and Ohio State hasn't. What's going to happen when Ohio State needs to score late in the game? Would we even see that there? We weren't even sure. We did. They missed a short field goal and lost a football game.
And
And
not only did
then
they miss the short field goal, they were stopped multiple times, and particularly on a fourth and short in Indiana territory very late in the game too.
so the lack of game pressure really did cost them, I think, because not only that, but I like we saw what Indiana did after the Big Ten championship game. I think the Hoosiers, that was their worst performance of their postseason. I think Indiana played better in the rest of the college football playoff games than they did in the Big Ten championship. So they lost that one. And then when it comes to the playoff game against Miami, Joe, I think they just weren't ready to play. You know, the offense didn't come ready to play. I thought the defense really did a good job of keeping them in the game. It looked like they were going to tie the game up at 7. Sayan throws a pick six, just like that. You're down 14-0. And ultimately, as Miami showed, they were probably one of the best teams in the country, and it was just too big of a mountain to climb for Ohio State. But they gave it a pretty good shot in that second half. But I think they lost the Indiana game because they didn't have enough game pressure, and I think they lost the Miami game because they were rusty in the first half.
Not only that, I think, I'm not going to blame Brian Hartline for taking a USF job, nor for the lack of preparation, which Ryan Day did admit in his post-game presser. The one thing I got to say is I think the Big Ten as a whole, especially at Ohio State's regular season schedule, clearly not Indiana for very obvious reasons, there wasn't much of pressure on Sayan from defensive lines. Normally you play Penn State and Michigan in a year, although that's changing in 26 with Penn State. Those are two teams that have produced a number of first round, at least day two, three NFL draft picks on the defensive line, particularly at the edge position, multiple years in a row. So you figured, hey, say it's going to get heated up a few times in these games. That was never the case. Michigan's D line was not existent in Ann Arbor, and a lot of that has to go to Ohio State's O line. Credit to them too. But kind of the moment he saw Miami's prolific pass rush as Indiana's, Julian Sand wasn't the same now. That's not because he's a bad player. It's not because he's not a good player. I just don't think he was used to it. And when you're seeing it in volume in a high pressure game against a team that, position for position are as good, if not better, it's really tough for a guy who was a redshirt freshman. I know he's 21 and everyone's going to yeah that, but it really is tough. And I think, there is value to me and Sean talked about in the playoff 2 years in a row. Each of the starting QBs in the national title game were transfer portal QBs, guys who played multiple years starting in college football,
And so was their guy the year before.
and so was Will Howard. Yes, so I look at that and then I see Sayin, and really, to a lot of people it was surprising. Maybe in hindsight it really wasn't.
And I think that the offensive line too can go to that game pressure part, Joe, where like Michigan, who had I would say like a maybe not for their standards, but still a pretty decent defensive line this year. They were able to do nothing against Ohio State, and I remember we were saying like, "Wow, is anybody gonna get to Julian saying like, yeah, he hasn't been under pressure, but maybe that might not happen." And then, unluckily for them, they probably play the two best pass rushes in the country in Indiana with their various stunts and corner blitzes and delayed linebacker stuff, and then Mesidor and Bain, who are first rounders for Miami, like that may have played a part in it too. That the offensive line clearly didn't have to do much blocking this year. We saw it with how little they were effective in the run game, and then when they had to, they just couldn't do it. So that is a sort of the headline of their season, Joe. They beat everybody they were supposed to, and unfortunately for them, they weren't really tested. That is not going to be the case next year, at least from what our preseason projections can say. So, Joe, before we slide it over to 2026, anything you want to say to wrap up the 2025 season for Ohio State?
I mean, overall, I know people are gonna, and kind of what me and Sean, we're gonna lambast at the end of it. Ohio State fans, Ohio State detractors, and just common college football observers. What I'll say is, I think overall for the year they had, it was overall like if I had to give it a grade, I give it a B plus. I think by all accounts, it's really hard to repeat. I think, beating Michigan is an accomplishment, whether people want to discount that game or not. That team truly cared about that game based on the way they prepped for it, the way they talked about it. And the reality is, as if a bad season is you lost by 3 points on a neutral to the national champion, and you had your worst game of your season against the national runner-up and still had a chance until like there were 4 minutes left, that's not so bad. So I think Ohio State, you're going to look at the guys that are leaving, going to the draft. You're going to miss a Caleb Downs, obviously a Carnell Tate, Sonny Styles, Arvell Reese. Like those are guys that you're going to kind of regret maybe not wasting their last years, but maybe not maxing them out. I thought they definitely could have gotten to that title game had they beaten Miami, but I don't think I don't think the sky is falling, nor do I think people who are reasonable are acting that way either in Columbus.
And I think the what we said going into the college football playoff, or at least I did, that I thought three teams could win the title: Indiana, Ohio State, Georgia. Now Miami certainly could have won the title, but
Totally.
like I think Ohio State, even though they lost twice, could have been the third or fourth best team in the country this year. And the only reason Miami overtook them is because they played their best football late in the year. Meanwhile, Ohio State played their best football probably in the middle to end part of the regular season. So, but they still do get some key pieces back, including number 4, Jeremiah Smith. He'll be um, most likely the number 1 pick in the 2027 NFL draft, barring any disasters. But Joe, like I said earlier, 2026 schedule here for Ohio State has been released. We did a post on it, a whole bunch of comments. That's been one of our best engagement tactics since we started this, Joe, is just posting somebody's schedule. um, no opinion, just here are the games and people arguing about how many wins they're going to have. So they do return the Texas game. They go down to Austin in the second week to play Texas. They start off the Big Ten with Illinois at home, and then Iowa, and then on the road. And then they also go later to Bloomington to play the Hoosiers on the road. They go to LA to play USC on the road. They go to Lincoln to play Nebraska on the road. This is an incredibly difficult Big Ten schedule. And then when you add on the fact that you are going on the road to a team that has as high of expectations as you do, they're going to be tested here. That's for sure.
Not only that, I think Texas, if there's any team nationally, we're not a national podcast that has more pressure than Texas. I really want to hear why. Maybe Miami, but Texas and Steve Sarkisian are under the most pressure to win a national title
Or
in all
just
of
make the
America.
playoff.
Yeah, or do something because and the reason I bring that up, Sean, is Texas is going to be favored in that game, and they're going to
Yeah.
feel that that is a total must win, especially because Texas also has an Ohio State similar schedule in the SEC. Getting off that game though, Sean, man, this is brutal. The fact one of your more easy games might be the home game against Michigan speaks volumes. It's your second toughest home game because your first toughest is going to be Oregon, who, by all accounts, is going to be a top three team in the country for most of the season, barring some sort of disaster. So I think Ohio State. I think people are overreacting if they say they're going to go 8-4, 9-3. I certainly think 10-2 is on the table, and that would still get you in the playoff. But then you get into that weird territory. If they do go 9-3, it's not like they're going to have bad wins. You could lose to Texas, Indiana, and USC, and still beat Oregon, Michigan, Iowa. Like it's insane that you know a team with this type of schedule and your rival, the team up north, is going to have a similar schedule. Both those teams at 9-3, I'd say, would have been top 12 teams, at least top 12 strength of schedules, they and there's a good chance they would get left out of the playoff with that record. That's nuts.
Yeah, so no team has made the playoff in the 2 years of the 12 team with 3 losses in the regular season. There have been some teams that have lost, as an at large team, that is, that have lost the third game in the championship game, like Alabama last year. So for Ohio State right now, I think that like it's going to be pretty difficult to just make the playoff. Like I think there's if they win all of them, they're number 1 in the country, all that. But there's a lot of games that they could lose here, and they still like if there's a 3-loss team that's going to make the playoffs, Joe, I think it's definitely Ohio State because you play four teams that I think will be ranked to start the year on the road, and
Yeah.
then you add two more ranked teams coming to play you. That's six ranked games. I mean, if you get out of there with 3 losses, that might be a good outcome. So they're obviously going to have to. I think the Texas game really opens up the season if they can win that, and then things that might be their toughest game all season, and then you do have a Big Ten game at home first against a team that you should beat in Illinois, but then you go to Kinnick in October, and we know what can happen there, and then you might get an easier one when Maryland comes, but then you get two away games, or you get away at Indiana, by away at USC. So I think this is a really, really tough schedule. I think that Ohio State could win anywhere between 8 and 12 plus games here.
Yeah, I agree, Sean. And one thing I'll say is talent-wise, they're still not going to be outclassed with
No.
Sayan, Smith, Bo Jackson, Isaiah West. Defensively. Defensively, I think, you're going to have plenty of guys that, similar to this year, a lot of no names going into the year, they'll make names for themselves. And one last thing, Sean, I'll say is I think the continuity of having Matt Patricia back, having Arthur Smith as the OC, I know people criticize that. I still think Ryan Day's hand is going to be heavy in the offense. Their offense has never truly, for a spurt of time, been bad. It's been underwhelming, but with Ryan Day there, it's never going to be bad. I think people have overreacted in saying that from both the Ohio State fan base and from other fan bases. So yeah, Shot, I think this will be a really big year for Ohio State. I think they're going to be tested more than they've been tested. I think this is the hardest schedule they've probably played since maybe like the Urban Meyer era because the Big Ten, by no fault of Ohio State, was down a lot pre like 18 teams, and with the way the nature of the schedule works, they haven't really had to play way too many challenging West Coast games aside from the one at Oregon against like a ranked team. So I think that will certainly change this year. And the expectation, Sean, I think is still going to be national title. I don't think that's necessarily fair with this schedule. I also don't think it's fair if they go 9-3 and are like the first team out to call it a failure. Now, result wise, yes, but I think you have to take that in stride because there's no way 99% of teams in the country go better than 9-3 with this schedule.
Yep. So it's going to be a tough one for Ohio State. We're going to wrap it up here. Thanks to everybody for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.